Greetings. As you can see, my name is Michael Andriano, and this is my vision statement for my future career as an ESL/EFL teacher. So for those of you who do not yet know, ESL stands for English as a Second Language. Similarly, EFL stands for English as a Foreign Language. Different middle letter, same overall meaning. I may use them interchangeably throughout the screencast. They mean the same thing. So this vision statement will encompass a variety of aspects of what I believe would make for a good ESL course, especially with regard to cultural awareness. Awareness of both the culture of my classroom and the cultures of my students. First things first, learners and hidden curriculum. The first thing that should be explained is the definition of culture. According to anthropologist Edward B. Tyler, as cited by anthropologist Dennis O'Neill, lots of anthropologists here, culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So all of those different aspects of culture affect how a person views the world around them. There are many different kinds of culture, including national culture, workplace culture, etc. However, this vision statement is primarily focused on classroom culture. In other words, how the rules, beliefs, and routines of my classroom will influence my students' experiences. Speaking of my students, I would reasonably anticipate that in an ESL course, there would be a diverse batch of students, or at least a batch of students whose culture may be the same as each other, but different from my own. For example, if I were to teach ESL in the United States, I would reasonably expect that my students would come from a variety of different cultural backgrounds. On the other hand, if I were to teach ESL in another country, such as Germany, for example, I would expect that most, if not all of my students, would have a shared German cultural background. So they would have the same culture, but it'd be different from mine. So there is a responsibility on me to have cultural awareness so that my culture and their culture doesn't come into conflict. So this potential for variability is a key aspect of my approach to teaching. My pedagogy. I never really got a definitive answer on how to pronounce that word. No matter where in the world I am teaching, it would be absurd to expect that each class throughout the years would come through my doors with the same levels of prior knowledge, motivation, life experience, etc. Each student is going to be different, and each class is going to be different year after year. Therefore, as you can see on this slide, my pedagogy will rely heavily on a concept that was introduced to me by Mary Cowie, the author of Black Ants and Buddhists, problem posing. So problem posing involves the posing of problems, of course, problems that a lesson will then aim to solve. So who poses these problems? Well, the students pose the problems. Students will enroll in my class for a particular reason, whether that reason is to get a job, to get accepted by an English-speaking college, or to just be able to watch all the great English language movies that there are out there. And certainly would have a different experience if you were watching Avengers Endgame and you couldn't speak English. So whatever my students' needs may be, I believe it will be my responsibility as their guide to the English language to help meet those needs. If I just focus on what I think is important, then my students may not care. With problem posing, my students would be directly involved in their learning in my class. I believe that by being involved in the progress of a class and the content of the class, students will be able to cultivate much more confidence and self-esteem because they will realize that they are taking charge of their learning, which is being used to address their needs in order to improve their lives. Makes it much more relevant to why they're getting out of bed to come to my class every morning and why they even signed up in the first place. So, now that I have determined how I will teach, it is time to discuss where I will teach. Well, a classroom, of course. That would be the simple answer. But I don't believe that an educator should ever just stop there. I believe that there needs to be careful thought and consideration put into how a teacher will design their classroom. After all, if a person's home is a reflection of how they live, a teacher's classroom is a reflection of how they teach. Pretty sure I came up with that line. I really like it. I'm gonna try to Spread that around. That's mine. Don't steal it. I really like that. I know from my own experience as a student that my first impression of every teacher that I've ever known has been influenced by the appearance of their classroom. For example, are the desks all facing forward? If so, I would assume that the class would involve a lot of lectures. Are the desks grouped in little groups? If so, then I would assume that the class would involve a lot of group work. Is there a life-size cutout of Darth Vader behind the teacher's desk? If so, then I would be excited to relate to my teacher about a mutual love of a particular pop culture movie franchise. That last example was based on a real-life experience, by the way. Shout out to my high school AP US history teacher. That was an awesome class. Alright, so moving on. According to Norris Johnson from the American Anthropological Association, it took me several tries to get that right, material artifacts are an integral part of the process of socio-cultural transmission. So, when students are walking into my classroom for the first time, what would I want that first impression to be? What kind of classroom culture would I want my classroom design to communicate? What would I want that to transmit into my students' conception of what they've just signed up for? Well, what I would want to communicate to my students is that my classroom is based on a culture of curiosity and comfortability. I want my students to think of my classroom as a space that they will enjoy coming to day after day, especially since a typical intensive ESL class involves 4 to 5 hours of instruction per day. That's a lot. With regard to curiosity, I want my students to look around my classroom and be excited to learn what they are going to learn and how they are going to learn it. With regard to comfortability, I do not only mean physical comfortability, that would be nice, considering you'd be sitting in a class for 4 to 5 hours every single day, aside from weekends, of course. So I do not mean just physical comfortability, but emotional comfortability as well. In other words, cultivating a comfortable environment means cultivating a low anxiety environment. And maintaining a low anxiety environment is crucial for ESL classes, or any language course for that matter. According to the effective filter hypothesis by Dr. Stephen Krashen, a personal hero of mine and pioneer in the field of language education, it is nearly impossible to teach a foreign language in a high-anxiety environment. According to Krashen, the effective language teacher is someone who can provide input and help make it comprehensible in a low-anxiety situation. So how do I plan to accomplish this? Well, by giving my students the ability to take ownership of the environment. That's right, first I am giving my students the ability to influence the curriculum, now I am giving them the ability to influence the classroom itself. I must be insane. Or very educated. You decide. According to a study from the Worldwide Fund for Nature, where the researchers examined what kinds of environments and environmental elements students liked best, it was determined that students were very receptive to the development of a sense of ownership and belonging. One way that I aim to accomplish this sense of belonging is through a giant world map that I will display in my classroom. I really like maps, that's one reason, but the next reason is even better. On the first day of class, I will have each student place a pin onto the map to indicate where they are from, whether it be from a different country or a different city within the same country. So if I were teaching in Germany, I would probably have a big map of Germany, and they could put the pin in whatever city or state they're from. Because otherwise you just have a big world map in Germany and have a bunch of clusters of pins in it. Wouldn't seem to be very diverse. So these pins would essentially be reminders of every student who has ever come to my class to learn English. And each student would be leaving both a literal and figurative mark on my classroom. Every day when my students come to class, they will each be able to see their own pin on the map and see a physical reminder that they are not just guests in my classroom, but an integral part of it. And then after several years of teaching, that map is going to be really cool, and I'll be able to look back on it and say, wow, I've had a good career. There's a lot of pins on this map. There's a lot of students that have left a literal and figurative mark on my life. So the next thing to talk about is the achievement gap and cultural bias. So first of all, what is the achievement gap? Well, the achievement gap is the trend of disparity between the opportunities and measurable educational achievement between different subgroups in a society. This trend is largely due to cultural bias, history, etc. Social inequalities are difficult to overcome and even more difficult to change. However, one way that I can help my students to overcome any inequality or cultural bias that they may be facing is through capital. Now, I do not mean physical capital, like money, because you can't just throw money at all the problems, and as an educator, I probably won't have enough money to throw at the problem anyway. I instead am referring to what Dr. Jean Anion describes as symbolic capital. Symbolic capital, according to Anion, includes socially legitimized skills, cognitive skills, linguistic skills, or technical skills. One of those stands out to me more than the others. Can you guess which one? Right, linguistic skills. Linguistic skills certainly seem to be relevant for an ESL class. Of course. In fact, linguistic skills can be extremely useful for closing that achievement gap. English linguistic skills in particular are useful since English is widely considered to be a global language, according to a reading from the International TEFL Academy, TEFL meaning Teaching English as a Foreign Language. English is a worldwide lingua franca and is the medium for an estimated 80% of the information stored in the world's computers, accounts for 3/4 of the world's mail, and is used in half of the world's technical and scientific periodicals. That's a big influence. Also, I know a fun fact that English is also the only language used by air traffic control around the world, so hey, if you want to work at airports, you gotta know English. In addition, according to James Tollefson, in an entry for the Electronic Journal for English as a Second Language, that's a mouthful, the English language's global prestige has unfortunately widened the achievement gap in many countries due to institutional constraints which have been created by dominant groups to prevent linguistic minorities from accessing social and political institutions. So basically, in some places, the achievement gap exists because of English. So if you want to cross that, sometimes the only way is to know English. The implication of this is that for some people, learning English is the only chance at getting ahead in their community. This sounds like a very valuable symbolic capital to me, and it will make me happy knowing that the curriculum that I plan to teach will directly help people to improve their lives. So before I go to the next slide, I would like to quickly touch on the other key aspect of this slideshow, how I plan to deal with placement tests. So for language courses, placement tests are very useful for figuring out which level of language instruction would be the best fit for each student. Whether they are a beginner, an intermediate, or an advanced learner. While I do plan on using placement tests because I would be teaching multiple levels of English and I want to figure out where students would best fit, it's useful for me, it's useful for them to know too. So while I will be using placement tests, the result of these tests will be more of a suggestion rather than a determinant. I believe that students know their abilities better than a piece of paper can. If a student believes that they could be successful in one of my more advanced ESL courses despite scoring low on the placement exam, then who am I to stand in the way of their ambition? Maybe they were having a bad day when they took the test, or maybe they know they're super motivated or that they're a quick learner. So, hey, if you want to take the advanced course, go for it. Because barriers to entry are annoying. And barriers to entry, in my opinion, cause the achievement gap. Like, you gotta know English to cross over this barrier. Widens the gap. So if you take down the barriers, much better chance at finding those opportunities. Alright, the next slide talks about culture as a disability. So first of all, what is a disability? Disability is anything that impedes a person's ability to function in society. If a person's culture is a disability, then that means that their cultural norms are so different than the mainstream that they are unable to participate or function in that society, or at least are unable to participate without enduring discrimination. One example of culture acting as a disability comes from the life of author Sherman Alexie. He grew up in the Spokane Reservation in the northwestern United States, where the mainstream culture was one that did not value educational achievement. Sorry, a lot of talking. Alexie, on the other hand, did value his education. Because Alexie's belief about education differed from his culture's mainstream belief about education, Alexie was often ridiculed and discriminated against by his peers. In the editorial Superman and Me, Alexie remarks how Gotta turn this phone off. So, in the editorial Superman and Me, Alexie remarks how, if he had been anything but an Indian boy living on the reservation, he might have been called a prodigy, but he is an Indian boy living on the reservation and is simply an oddity. By the way, his words, Indian, not mine. Not a big fan of the term, but I was directly quoting him, so that's what he said. Alexie's story is a reflection of how whenever someone tries to stray from the path of least resistance, they are met with resistance. In my classroom, if any student wants to step outside of their cultural expectations of their culture, who am I to stop them? Who am I to judge them for it? Furthermore, I will ensure that all of my students will be able to participate fully in any classroom activities. My classroom activities will be designed and planned so that everyone can participate. For example, if I have Jewish students in my class, it would be very insensitive of me to hold class on Saturdays. If I did, then any Jewish students would have to make an uncomfortable decision between following their cultural beliefs and getting an A in my class. Next, we have pop culture and core rituals. So pop culture can be very useful as a well of fun and recognizable examples for foreign language lessons. For example, instead of using bird as a noun to practice the verb fly, we could use the noun Superman. That certainly would be more fun, unique, and engaging than a bird. Right? Sure, it could, unless you've never heard of Superman, and then you would just be confused. Whenever pop culture is discussed or used to contextualize lesson material, it is important to consider who that pop culture is relevant to. According to Gustavo Fishman from the University of California, Los Angeles, pop culture involves the dissemination of information and is a reflection of what is funny or humorous in a given society at a given time. That means that something that is part of mainstream pop culture in one society may be completely unknown in a different culture. Therefore, just as I plan to use students' own problems and needs to shape my curriculum, I will incorporate students' cultures, popular culture, into my lessons. For examples, allusions, analogies, etc. With regard to rituals, rituals are the routines and customs that a culture practices. One type of cultural ritual is conversation. As a language class, conversation will be a cornerstone of my lessons and activities. Specifically, that conversation will be conducted in English, exclusively in English if possible, as a means to promote language acquisition through immersion. Speaking English will become a ritual of my classroom's culture. This ritual will help to promote learning of the material through practice and active use, as well as creating a unified cultural trait that my students will share when they enter my classroom. Speaking and learning English. After all, language is an important aspect of culture. All right, culturally responsive teaching. So for this final section of my vision statement, I would like to discuss the theme of the vision statement as a whole, especially with regard to Dr. James A. Banks' 5 dimensions of multiculturalism. Specifically, I would like to discuss his third dimension of multiculturalism, which I find most useful, which he calls equity pedagogy. Equity pedagogy, according to Banks, involves a teacher making modifications to how they teach rather than what they teach. To me, this is what culturally responsive teaching is all about, making sure that lessons and activities are designed with consideration for different beliefs, values, learning preferences, etc. For example, from the readings of the International TEFL Academy, they identify what they call direct cultures and indirect cultures. They are 2 examples of different cultural categories that they identify. So according to the International TEFL Academy, in a direct culture, people are not afraid to speak their minds or challenge the opinions of others, including the instructor. On the other hand, in an indirect culture, voicing personal opinions, especially those that differ from those of peers and instructors, is a cultural taboo. The implication of this is that certain lesson activities may be appropriate in one culture while being inappropriate in another culture. For example, holding a classroom debate about a controversial topic may be a fun and engaging exercise for students in a direct culture, such as Germany, but would be extremely anxiety-provoking and uncomfortable for students in an indirect culture, such as Japan. Therefore, I believe that it will be important for me to consider what kinds of lessons will help my students to thrive and which kind of lessons would hinder that achievement. For example, which lessons would cause my students. Therefore, I believe that it will be important for me to consider what kind of lessons will help my students thrive and which lessons would hinder that achievement. In other words, which lessons would cause my students' culture to become a disability, because I don't want that. Alright, thank you very much for watching this screencast. I hope I was able to effectively communicate my thoughts and what I have learned throughout the course. I also hope that you were able to learn something about foreign language learning. Thank you.